It's our last conference of this discussion season on power transition. The last conference of this discussion season by Eastern Circles, the Geopolitics Club, which discusses the past, the present, and the future of the post-Soviet region. We're happy and excited to welcome Sergei Guriev, former chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and today professor of economics at Sciences Po Paris. And we are going to, of course, talk about the economics of power transition. Also, this theme in itself is not just a concluding theme for the season, but also a bridge theme with our next discussion season, which is going to start in September and which is going to deal with energy diplomacy. So a lot more economics and business topics, including the hydrocarbons, green energy, hydro energy, and hydrogen in the region, potential, of course, about hydrogen. We would like to, this is pretty much the next slide. We would also like to remind anybody who is interested to check out our Slack community, where a larger community of members are sharing their readings and events, and also even job posts in and about the region. And so with that, without further ado, we're going to stop sharing the slides and turn straight directly to Sergei Guriev, who kindly joined us today. Thank you very much, Sergei, for taking your time and for agreeing to join us. We're going to just turn to the first question. We were thinking how to approach the whole subject of power transition, the economics of power transition. We decided to start from today's biggest economic crisis, so to say, the COVID crisis. And the first question is, how do you place, would you place this crisis in terms of magnitude and impact on the countries of the post-Soviet space? Well, these are the countries which have seen wars, right? Which have seen their whole economies melt down after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Then they were affected by 1998 financial crisis in Russia, to which they were very much tied back then, much more than today, even through their economies. And then 2008 global financial crisis. Where do you place this crisis, and how do you compare it in level of pain?
Thank you very much for inviting me, Anastasia. It's great to see many familiar faces, and indeed, I'll try to be informative, even though I'm pretty sure that people around the table know what I'm going to say anyway. You're fully qualified to discuss those issues. So, in economic terms, this crisis for most of Russia's neighbors and for Russia itself is not as big as the crisis of early 1990s. In some of those countries, the early transition years were extremely tough and were accompanied by a war, which had further economic impact. And the GDP decline would be in the range of several tens of percentage points. So Russia lost 40% of its GDP from pre-transition peak to transformational recession bottom, and some other countries actually did even worse. So it's not comparable to 2020 when Russian GDP went down by 3%. Now, when you think about other country-specific crises, so you think about, say, Ukraine, which in 2014, 15, 16 went through a very painful recession driven by war, depreciation, and all kinds of stuff, debt crisis, all kinds of stuff which were accompanying this. So that's also something which is much bigger than what's going on right now. So in that sense, this crisis is important, but it's not a once in a lifetime crisis like it is in the West. So if you think about a country like France, where we are right now, we're talking about -8%, -6% of GDP fall. Now, incomes didn't suffer as much because French government, like many Western governments, have been quite generous, but still, it's a huge one in a lifetime crisis. We've not seen that since Great Depression in the Western world, but for our countries, it's of course smaller. Now, there is an important twist to that, which is in terms of human lives lost, in some of our countries, some of post-communist countries, that's been a very costly year. And just to give an estimate on Russia, now we are talking about excess mortality of something like 500,000 people. And this is much worse than the shock of transition. Now, during the transition, what happened, mortality went up. And overall, for example, in Russia, we are talking about 2 million people who died. But usually the scholars attribute that to the removal of anti-alcohol campaign. And basically, these are delayed deaths rather than new deaths, in the sense that these lives were mostly saved by Gorbachev during anti-alcohol campaign and then lost when this campaign was finished. So it's very hard to attribute these 2 million deaths to the shock of transition. So one other statistic that I will leave you with, comparing to 1990s. So the shock of 1990s was still very harsh, even if it's not led to high mortality. It did leave long-term traces. So one of the papers I've written, which is coming up in the journal called Economic Policy, looks at the height of kids born during the transition. So these kids finally grew up to their adult height. And so with my co-authors, we measured actually around post-communist world, the adult height of these kids, and compare them to kids born before and after transition. And we show that people who were born during transition from plant to market have grown up to 1 centimeter shorter adult height, which is a huge number. It's comparable to being born during a conflict, during a war. So this is a major impact, which shows the level of deprivation. So I'm pretty sure that what we are observing today is not comparable. It's much milder than what we observed in the 1990s in terms of socioeconomic shock and deprivation. And I'm not saying that reforms drove deprivation. In some countries, maybe it was deprivation which eventually resulted in reforms and political change. But it was the time that people remember as a time of a very important, one-in-a-lifetime shock, and 2020 is much milder.
Thank you, Sergei. The second question is going to be about to continue on the impact of COVID, so to say, on certain number of economies. In March last year, we saw negative prices of oil, something that few people could have imagined. And that, of course, had devastating impacts on the budgets of oil-dependent economies like Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. This is not a new phenomenon. We've seen the same thing after every financial crisis, which triggers low demand. So the gap in demand, we see that, and we see the same gap in the budget. We've seen it in 1998, we've seen it in 2008 again, in 2014 when the oil prices crashed again. And after every crisis, and as well as now, the government comes out and they say, for example, in Russia and in other countries, we have the same patterns. In Kazakhstan, we observe the same, and talks about the necessity of economic reform. Yet we never observe this systemic change, systemic reform, despite this rhetoric. Why not?
So this is a great question, and indeed, it's not the first time in history of the very same government. So I mentioned Azerbaijan. This is the very same family that's been running this country for quite a while. You may say that you've had a transition in Kazakhstan, but some people actually doubt that. So you can see the very same group of people running the country in those places, and so that's not the first oil price shock for them. And indeed, oil prices have recovered quite quickly. So today, oil prices are in the range of $75 per barrel. Nobody would have dreamt about that 20 years ago. In any event, why and why not? Why no reform? So let me tell you a story of Azerbaijan. In 2014, oil prices come down. 2014, they come down and continue sliding in 2015 and 16, and sometimes reach levels as low as $30 per barrel. Azerbaijan was mostly thinking that they need a price of $50 per barrel to make their budget balanced. And so they are really worried They start talking to international financial organizations, to the IMF. And the IMF says, you need to reform this, and this. The Azerbaijani ruling family introduces certain younger people into the government with a mandate of reform, and then oil prices recover and nothing happens. And this sounds familiar probably to you as you ask this question. And the reason for that is, first and foremost, there is still no prolonged decline in oil prices. With a price like 60, 70, 75, all these countries are doing well. They still have a large sovereign wealth fund, and they're happy to survive a short-term oil price shock. Now, these countries do face a long-term problem. So over the next 10 years, oil price will probably decline. Over the next 10 years, oil demand, global oil demand will probably peak because of the green economic transition, green energy transition. But there are huge costs in diversifying the economy for regimes running those countries. Why? Because in order to diversify the economy, you need to create business climate conducive to non-oil businesses, which means competitive environment, openness to non-oil foreign investment, rule of law, anti-corruption policies. And all of that leads to creation of non-oil business class, which may ask for political representation as well. And this is what these governments don't like. In principle, they would have loved to have a diversified, competitive, healthy economy, but not at the cost of losing their hold on power. And when they make those choices, they say, status quo is fine. Status quo is great. I like the status quo. Yes, economy is not growing as fast as it should. Yes, it's diversified. Yes, it's vulnerable to oil price shocks, but at least I'm in charge and I still get the oil rent, and at the price of even 50, but more so of 70, life is not that bad. So we shouldn't be surprised that no reform is happening when oil price shortly goes down. Before it recovers, they may use sovereign wealth funds that they build up for the rainy day, and that's it. That's pretty much it.
That's it's an interesting thing on which you're touching the sovereign wealth fund, actually, because in your article on the informational autocrats, you name the need for the to advertise the economic success as a driving need of an autocratic regime. This is something that they propose, so to say, in exchange for political freedoms. In Russia, of course, this has been especially important, where the projections and comparisons of the fat Putin years with the lean Yeltsin years have made up a part of official government propaganda since the late 1990s. Yet after 1 year of COVID, we saw a curious development. While the National Wealth Fund of Russia grew in this very, very rainy year, not just day, a year and a half, we saw the income of an average Russian, if such a person exists, right, the average income decline, and the percentage of the poor in Russia grow. So this is given that the whole foundation of the National Wealth Fund in the early 2000s was in order to serve as a pillow, so to say, a buffer against to prevent the huge impact of a big financial crisis, which has just happened. Why has the government ignored the advice of some of the very conventional economists like Guriev or Alexei Kudrin, as well as the economists which are now broad, like Hugh or Igor Sonin, who have advocated for a long time since the beginning of the crisis to increase the distribution on the Western pattern? And it seems that it has decided to not do so, parting with its official discourse of economic, so to say, prosperity. Why is this decision? What is the logic behind?
So you're right that the Sovereign Wealth Fund was created exactly for the rainy day. And during 2008, 2009, it was actually used. And one of the biggest achievements of 2008, 2009 was, even though there were mistakes which resulted in a huge decline of Russian GDP in 2009, Russian GDP went down by 8%. Incomes of Russian households actually did not go down. on the annual basis in 2009, Russian household incomes went down by 2%. That cost a lot of money. That cost a lot of money in the sovereign wealth fund. It went down from something like 20% of GDP to 12% of GDP. And so probably by 2020, Russian government thought, who knows, maybe negative oil prices will stay. And so we need this 10% of GDP, which is now in the war chest. Maybe this low oil price period will stay. That's the only reason I can refer to that provides a rational explanation for what you've described. Indeed, I think it was a huge mistake, huge political mistake, and I praise Alexei Navalny, who advocated exactly the course of action that you suggested. And his what's called 5 steps plan was hugely popular. That probably resulted in decline of Putin's popularity in June and July, which was probably one of the reasons that contributed to the decision to poison Alexei Navalny in August. So yet, Mr. Putin thought that it would be unsafe to spend too much money and lose the war chest before there may be another decline in oil prices. So you probably are too young to remember the iconic Deniska stories, a child's book in Soviet Union. There was a boy who was thinking about his career choices, and he wanted to become a famous around the world traveler. And one of his role models was a French traveler who went around the world and only ate raw fish. And on that diet, he lost 24 kilos. And so Deniska was a bit worried that his whole weight at the point was 25 kilos. So he was worried that if he missed fishing one fish one day, maybe he would disappear altogether. And I think that's exactly the logic of Mr. Putin. We have 11% of GDP in the war chest. Maybe the crisis will cause us 8%, and who knows, maybe we will not get that fatty fish at some point and have no money at all, and we'll have to ask IMF for help, and this is not something we want to do. And some of the sovereign wealth fund is actually invested in illiquid assets, such as infrastructure projects. So it's not exactly 11% of GDP as they want to. So they wanted to be safe. They wanted to play safe. I think politically it's very costly, yet they made this decision. Why? They were confident that it would work because they still controlled the Novichok stocks on one hand and propaganda and censorship on the other hand. It's not only the sovereign wealth fund that was increased during 2020, but also spending on propaganda. So that was quite striking in the sense that the budget for 2021 was moving in the direction of austerity on healthcare, but was adding resources towards Russia Today. Why? Because this perceived reality is what matters. Eventually, the truth will catch up with the perceptions, but indeed, you mentioned our paper on informational autocrats, and I would emphasize that indeed this autocracy really cares about what people think, and for that, it's not the reality on the ground which matters, but what people think about this reality which matters. Russian households' incomes go down, but the perception that Mr. Putin sells is they would have gone down even more if somebody else were in charge. And that's the argument he needs to sell. It doesn't sell as well as before, but it's still quite successful in the sense that with all the decline in Mr. Putin's popularity, majority of Russians approve of Mr. Putin's work. So that is still the case, and so propaganda and censorship still works.
You started upon this subject that indeed, when we're talking about average decline in income, that doesn't really reflect average decline in receiving money from the state for every single actor. And pretty much that shortfall, which for the 2020 budget was estimated, in about $40 billion, right, from that falling price of oil and the average low price of oil through the year, has resulted in budget cuts for some and in similar or even greater spending for others. Who were these beneficiaries and who were the losers of COVID? And how do you compare these decisions of the Russian government with the other petro states in the post-Soviet space?
So non-post-Soviet petrostate did a good job. So I would rather compare Russia to the West, indeed. And basically, in Russia, this austerity resulted in lower spending on all kinds of categories of income recipients from the state, reduced public investment, but increased spending on the police and increased spending on doctors, which was good. In 2020, they did increase spending on doctors, which was good, and increase spending on propaganda. That's in short the reaction to the crisis. Now, how much money was spent exactly on defense, we don't know, because part of that is actually secret. So.
And you see that in other states there was no difference like that. Like in Azerbaijan, in Kazakhstan, they didn't make other decisions. They didn't like increase the payments to the population, for example, or did some other grand gesture to appease, to amortize the pain a little bit. Because these countries, they also saw this influx. Some of these countries, not all, but some of the countries of the post-Soviet space, they also saw the influx of migrants from other areas, and not necessarily excessive resources to welcome them. Which governments maybe made some good decisions? What were the examples which are less kind of usual?
So in those countries, I actually talked a lot to various high-ranking people in Kazakhstan, and I think, unfortunately, no good decisions were made. One of the things that they lobbied, and I think it was a good idea, is to use this crisis to deregulate. Because if you don't want to help business with cash, at least reduce the regulatory burden. And unfortunately, even that didn't happen. So and that's why I think the comparison with the West is due. In the West, everywhere in the West, basically, the governments rolled out generous support to businesses, especially to small, medium-sized businesses, and to households. And this is not what was done in Russia and neighboring countries. And that I think was a mistake. This is exactly, as you rightly said, an example of a rainy year when it's time to spend rather than time to tighten the budgets. But unfortunately, that was what happened.
On this overall kind of situation, when we observe that whether we see it with the lower oil prices or we see it with sanctions, whether against Russia or against Belarus right now, when we come back to the question of autocratic regime stability, whether we see the enormous exposure of corruption, right, that was undertaken by Alexei Navalny's team throughout the years, almost 10 years, and massive kind of understanding of this realization. Like in the beginning of when Alexei Navalny started making his videos, the viewership was barely reaching 10 millions, right, per video. And by the unfortunate, so to say, we can say so far the end of his career, right, in this year, the viewership of about Putin's palace outreached 120 million, which for Russia is extraordinarily important, right? Yet none of these things, neither the fall of the oil price, nor sanctions, nor corruption exposure, which you have also talked about a lot in your lectures, and is a common knowledge pretty much across the region now. None of this leads to a change of regime in itself. It seems that the economic conditions, they just is not a weak spot, so to say, of the government. What are the pillars which keep the autocratic regimes in place, and why is it that the economy is so almost irrelevant?
So indeed, as you rightly said, there are different pillars of autocratic stability. A famous American political scientist Adam Przeworski said that authoritarian equilibrium rests on lies, fear, and prosperity. And so every autocrat uses the manipulation of information, lies, uses repression, fear, and uses prosperity. And you rightly said that these regimes are losing their legitimacy based on income growth. And so they need to invest more into manipulation of information and repression. And so Putin's equilibrium initially was based on prosperity. The first 10 years were the best in Russian history. But then corruption has destroyed growth. And eventually Putin found a new source of legitimacy, which was annexation of Crimea and this imperial nostalgia. So that worked for a while, but I think by now we can certainly say that it faded away. And so he had to invest more in information and more in repression. Initially more in information and censorship. In 2015, Russia passed a law that foreigners cannot own media. So Russia took over Forbes and Vedomosti. Recently, they started to harass so-called foreign agents, media foreign agents, and so they greatly hit Medusa and some others. And so this offensive continues. Now, one thing I would like to mention is it's not true that Navalny's videos didn't matter. They did hit popularity of Medvedev and Putin. So as a scholar, I wrote a paper about how mobile broadband internet undermines the confidence in government, especially in corrupt governments, as long as internet is not fully censored. And the referees asked us to provide case studies. And so we looked at Romania, Brazil, and Russia. And in Russia, we actually looked at the story of the 2017 movie about Medvedev made by Navalny. And so we looked at the data. We looked at the survey from Levada and survey from Navalny himself, who also runs sociological polls. And so what I can tell you is that was the first video, as you rightly said, that went way beyond 10 million, right? And basically it was watched, by now it's been watched by 40 million people, while the other videos would be watched exactly 10 million times. And so what we saw there was that destroyed Medvedev's popularity ratings. The approval ratings went down by 10 percentage points and never recovered. That's why Medvedev is no longer in the game. He cannot be a respected politician anymore. So today, for example, United Russia is heading into elections, and the official leader of the party, Mr. Medvedev, is not on the ballot. So I think that is directly related to the 2017 video, and we actually show how the connection is made. And it's not just people who watched the movie, but also people who've heard about the movie. But actually, 2 weeks later, after the movie was produced, 80% of Russians have not even heard about the movie. And so that's the story. Censorship matters. You need to make sure that those things are not viewed. And so this is why Mr. Navalny is in jail, exactly because, as you rightly said, the latest movie about Putin's palace was so effective that Mr. Putin had to do something about this. And now that's what we see right now. We see how Putin's regime is moving in the direction of Maduro's or Lukashenko's regime. And again, Venezuela is a great example where you have a regime of Chavez based on charisma, censorship, propaganda, and prosperity. Chavez presided over very high oil prices. And then Maduro has no charisma, no oil money. And so he uses fear. And this is a brutal, repressive regime, which is still in power, despite that GDP is half what it used to be. So the economic deprivation is much bigger than what we can observe today in Belarus or Russia. And in that sense, the durability of a brutal, repressive regime should not be underestimated. So if you ask me if the lack of income growth and the outright corruption that is becoming better and better known by the Russians would result in the regime change in Russia, I won't really bet my money on the short-term regime change in Russia. And if anything, I would say the more Russians are aware of corruption, the more effective Mr. Navalny's team is in exposing corruption, the less successful Russian government is in terms of economic growth, the more repressive the regime has to become. And so, unfortunately, the issues you just mentioned may predict more repression next year than last year. And that's unfortunately what I would predict in the short run. In the long run, of course, I believe this regime cannot survive because it's on the wrong side of history, and eventually it will disappear somehow. But unlike Maduro, for example, it's a regime with nuclear weapons, so it may be even more durable than we think.
Yeah, that's a dark picture you're painting in the long run.
In the long run, things will be fine, yes.
As Mr. Maynard Keynes used to say, things will be fine in the long run. Now, in one of your lectures on, you suggest also that the West doesn't play the role it should in curbing the Russian corruption and in general the corruption from other countries in this region, because a lot of people, a lot of elites, so-called elites in the region, they have a habit of parking their money in the West. You named especially the Netherlands as an all-time champion of all the European countries in terms of hosting the Russian money. And then there are, of course, the usual suspects like Cyprus, Luxembourg, and the UK, and then further go France and Germany, for example. So nobody's hands are clean, and you are doing well. It's easy, actually, if you want to make the life of the elites difficult and to impact them, just have to, you know, just act upon it and do not serve safe haven. However, my question is, well, the European Union has a habit and a long history of cooperating with numerous brutal and cannibalistic regimes, including African and Middle Eastern countries. And in addition to this, the trillions, what you're saying, trillions of euros actually do look good for the national budgets of these countries. Why would they shoot themselves in the foot and deprive themselves of this income, while on the one hand, just by introducing a different standard for Russia than they have for all the other autocratic regimes, so to say, and while at the same time, we haven't seen yet that sanctions, economic sanctions, have been extraordinarily efficient in changing corrupt behavior. Why would the European Union distinguish Russia of all places?
Thanks. It's a great question. Since we talk so much about this paper, Informational Autocrats, let me advertise a book. It's very hard to make forecasts, especially about the future. But one thing I'm pretty certain of is that the book based on this article called Spin Dictators, together with Daniel Trisman, will come out in Princeton University Press next spring, where we do have a chapter on what we think the West should do. And we should understand that regimes like Putin's regime are very likely to weaponize corruption in the way that it's not just to park the money in London that Putin needs. Putin also needs to use the corrupt money to undermine Western democratic institutions for two reasons. One is the weaker the West and the more preoccupied the West is with its own problems, the less the West can invest in improving the state of the world outside the West, including Russia. The second issue is exactly the propaganda issue. So you show that the West is corrupt, and so Russian citizens should be more tolerant to corruption in Russia. And so for all these reasons, regimes like Russian regime will use corruption to undermine the functioning of Western democratic institutions. And that's why fighting the use of corrupt money, the invasion of Russian corrupt money in the West, is not just in my interest as a Russian taxpayer, but also in the West's interest in order to protect itself. Now, the West understands that. If you, for example, look at what Biden does, Biden recently signed an executive order on fighting corruption. If you look at 5 Mogherini principles, they are called 5 Mogherini principles, but they're actually 5 EU principles, and they're updated by Josep Borrell, how EU should deal with Russia. There is a lot about resilience of European institutions themselves, and that includes not just resilience to cyber attacks, but also resilience to money laundering and use of corrupt money. So I think this is of first order of importance. Now you're asking why the West would do that. The answer is the West is now waking up to the problems that such investments imply for the West itself. So it's not just to push back Mr. Putin, it's also to protect the West's own future. And I think this understanding is growing. Now, you mentioned that sanctions don't change regimes. Now, sanctions cannot really change the regime. Sanctions can change behavior. Now, in some cases, again, I guess regimes miscalculate and sanctions result in the change of the regime. But usually sanctions are to deter aggressive behavior by autocratic regimes. So you introduce sanctions against Iran, and Iran comes to a negotiating table. You introduce sanctions against Mr. Putin, and Mr. Putin does not annex east of Ukraine, but instead negotiates a Minsk agreement. So I won't really say that Minsk agreement is a great success, but I would say that there is a difference between Crimea and Donetsk. So sanctions that were introduced between March 2014 and September 2014 eventually made sure that this conflict is frozen. And even Mr. Putin says that Donetsk is part of Ukraine, and it should remain part of Ukraine. And this is also part of the reason why sanctions are introduced. So this is I think how it works. Now, talking about other autocrats in Africa and so on that you mentioned, well, the West indeed didn't realize to what extent it is dangerous to allow corrupt elites around the world to launder their money in the West. But now there is a great movement, exactly because there is more and more research showing that we are indeed talking about trillions of dollars. So there is an economist, actually a French economist who works in Berkeley, Gabriel Zucman, who wrote a book, actually a couple of books about this, and his estimate is indeed that illicit wealth, offshore wealth, accounts for $8 trillion, which is about 10% of global GDP. So it's a huge amount, and we now see more and more attention paid to that. And after President Trump was gone, the United States joined the effort to help fighting tax evasion by large corporations. And I'm sure there'll be more and more transparency in terms of ultimate beneficiaries of real estate in Europe, UK, and the US. So there is a fight. It's not enough, but it's definitely going in the right direction.
Thank you. A question about another point you're making in the Information Autocrats article, which is about incompetence, the connection between autocratic governments and eventual drifting toward incompetence. Even if it starts off as competent, eventually the government is getting more and more suspicious, any autocratic government, and it roots for loyalty, it looks for loyalty. And if competent people in the government happen to also become critical with time, the preference is given to loyal but less competent people. And this same point is also raised in several other articles by prominent Russian economists. And my question is, how much of it is due to incompetence, is due to autocratic regime, and how much is it due just to bad governance? Because if we look at countries who have succeeded with transition of power, be it Armenia or Ukraine or Moldova or Kyrgyzstan, they do not, on the other hand, lack any examples of incompetence. How much of it is due to the government, how much to just bad government?
That's an excellent question, and indeed I would refer to an article by other prominent Russian economists, my co-authors Georgy Guriev and Konstantin Sonin, who emphasized this issue of loyalty versus competence. This paper is called "Dictators and Their Viziers: analyzing how dictators, sultans choose incompetent viziers. So what I would say is it's very hard to compare countries with different levels of development and different human capital. So Russia was a center of an empire. So it would actually suck in best talent for decades. That's why best universities in that empire were in Moscow, best scholars and best bureaucrats were also in Moscow. And so it's very hard to compare it to a much poorer country which was sending its best and brightest to Moscow for generations. So Russia is supposed to be more competent, and it is scary that some of the decisions are really, really bad. Now, some decisions are really incompetent. Now, you're mentioning some countries which are more democratic than, say, Russia or Kazakhstan. So you mentioned Moldova, Armenia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, but and saying that they're not doing that well. I would say that yes, democracy is not a sufficient condition for competence and prosperity. Some countries may fall prey to the rise of oligarchy and crony capitalism, even with certain, albeit imperfect, democratic institutions. But if you have oligarchic regime, it's also corrupt, and it's also not likely to generate economic growth and prosperity. And that's what we observe in some of these countries. So yet there is another observations I would make. Yes, there are many poor democratic countries. There are some prosperous democratic countries. There are many poor autocratic countries, but there are almost no rich non-democratic countries. So if you want to find a competent non-democratic regime, that is just Singapore. So there is one exception, Singapore, which is a huge exception. And I'm happy to talk about why Singapore is different from Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, or Russia. But we know it's different, right? It's very clear that it's an exception, while what's happening in other non-democratic regimes is rather a rule. And Singapore was actually taking pride in fighting corruption, while in the countries we just mentioned, you see a lot of cronyism and sometimes familism, meaning that in some of these countries, it's literally one or two families which run the countries. Sometimes these families actually are intermarried. So in one of those countries, the first vice president is a wife of the president. So this is not a coincidence, because in non-democracies, as you rightly said, competence is suppressed because of the lack of political competition. Now, occasionally you have great breakthroughs in competence in even oligarchies. And I was extremely hopeful regarding Ukraine, and I'm still hopeful. But in Ukraine, you have step forward, step back, where you have extremely competent people making real impact in certain areas. And I'm happy to talk about what's happened in Ukrainian procurement, or at some point in anti-corruption, not necessarily today. At some point in the central bank, there are also reversals. In Ukraine, Ukrnaftogaz, not sure about that today, but still. So there are breakthroughs, and Ukraine is still an oligarchic economy, so it always succeeds to push back. But in some places, you see also tangible progress, such as in Georgia. You also had backlash, but in Georgia, 20 years ago, you would say no competence, no nothing. The state is, there is a failed state. And then you see influx of competent people, some of them coming back from the outside, building pockets of not just success, but of excellence, creating examples for other countries, learning from Georgian experience. And the same may still happen in Armenia. And in Armenia, of course, there is a big challenge of being prosperous next to two neighbors who just hate you and are ready to destroy you, and therefore relying for your survival on Russia, which is a corrupt and unreliable friend. So judging Armenia is very hard. Judging Moldova is also very hard. Judging Ukraine is also very hard because of all the security issues. So it's not easy. It's not easy to talk about those issues. But overall, I would say democracy is necessary, but not a sufficient condition, unless you're a Singapore. Singapore can do things well without democracy. Now, the other exception is Middle Eastern oil monarchies. These countries are not necessarily very competent, but they're actually high-income countries. But the reason is they have much more oil per capita than Russia does.
The last question before we switch to the audience is, again, coming back to your hypothesis that you advance in the informational autocrats. You also are bringing up a very important point today for Russia, which is the need of the autocratic regime to exchange experience and to exchange the lessons learned and to share. And you all draw especially the example of China during the Mao Zedong years, and then later dictators of China, where they would come to Russia for advice or to Singapore for advice, and then Singaporeans would lecture them on how they should be more fine in their, had more finesse in their repression. And today it seems that tables have turned. China, of course, all of the oppression and is playing out a lot on early detection and suppression by knowledge, and therefore a lot of it is played out in the IT field. And of course, China there is way more advanced than a lot of, not only Russia, a lot of Western countries, and especially in surveillance and AI techniques, which are not restrained by a regulation. And Russia, we've seen that especially during the COVID year, right? Russia has increased a lot under the COVID cover, we can say, has increased a lot the surveillance techniques and sophistication, even on the very basic street level. We're talking very basic camera surveillance, to say nothing of more sophisticated surveillance. What can you say are the lessons learned? How important has the Russian cooperation with China been to empower more the Russian autocratic regime, the exchange of technology, maybe purchase of technology, and where does it bring Russia?
So I think this is a very important question, and there is a lot of uncertainty in there. So what I've been talking about so far is based on what we've seen in the past. But as they say in financial markets, the past performance is no guarantee for future performance. And we may actually enter an age where things are different. And one big difference is exactly related to what you've said. China is one of the leaders in artificial intelligence, exactly because it's not constrained by privacy, because it has huge amounts of data. This is something that is hard to do in a less competitive, in a more competitive economy, where the overall national data array is not available to one player, which is Chinese government. And in that sense, what we may see is the reinforcement, the positive feedback loop, where the dictatorship enhances the development of AI, and AI reinforces the repressive techniques. Sometimes preventive repressive techniques, because you don't need to kill people, you just need to identify them before they commit crime, like in dystopian novels by Philip K. Dick. So it's something that we may see in the future, something we've not seen in the past, where in the past, democracies have outperformed autocracies in technology. Whatever we think about Soviet engineering miracles, they came to a dead end eventually. But if you think about China and AI, we may see a future in which China actually is the world leader in AI and eventually outperforms the West and becomes a technologically advanced country, high-income country, unlike any other autocracy before it. And so this is a scary future, but it may be the future. And it has not happened in history before, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in the future. So I'm worried about this. Some people would say I shouldn't be worried because China is still facing huge challenges related to demographics, human capital, inefficient government. So there are many problems China is going to face. And it is exactly now when China is moving from the system that served it so well for 40 years with checks and balances, regular rotation, and meritocracy, to a personalized dictatorship, which China may have learned from Putin, by the way, without term limits. And maybe it is today when China will lose its agility and nimbleness. Who knows? But there is a risk that we are entering an age where autocracies technologically outperform democracies, and we should be worried about this for sure. And of course, this is where China exports its technology to other autocrats. Actually, not only autocrats, but it does. And so we should be worried not just about China, but about the rest of the world. So I think you're right. We should be worried.
Thank you, Sergei. We're going to now turn to the audience, and I know that Tatiana Jean, the head of the Russia NCS Center in the French Institute of Foreign Relations, has a question about green energy. Go ahead, Tatiana.
Nastya, thank you very much. It's Sergei. So thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to assist to your presentations. You have a real talent, I think, to speak in very simple terms about complicated things and to link political, economic, social aspects. I have a question about green energy transition that you mentioned in the beginning. Russia's main trade partners are all moving to the green agenda. The European Union, of course, but China too. Russia will not be able to stand aside. And there are concerns among Russian companies, particularly because of the European carbon border adjustment mechanism. How will Russia adapt itself to this changing context? Would it be an imitation of the adaptation, or can it be real?
Tatiana, so if you asked me this question a year ago, I would say that Russian elite completely neglects this issue. Says it doesn't occur, it's not going to happen.
It's changing, of course.
And it's changed a lot just within a year. And so if you look at the agenda of St. Petersburg Economic Forum, International Economic Forum, you see already that half of Russian business or policy advisors mention this. They now believe that carbon border adjustment mechanism is happening. Now, its impact on Russian exports is not really dramatic. So it's not negligible. We are talking about several billion dollars a year. But this is not something that is going to kill Russian economy or even competitiveness of Russian exports. Now, what is going to change is Russian businesses, like in particular producers of steel, will think about those issues and will do more. Russian government will also do something. It's not clear what. There is now a lot of debate. For some reason, Russia believes that Russia should invest in green hydrogen or blue hydrogen and something like this. But there is now much more awareness about those issues. And as long as carbon price in Europe is going to rise, Russians actually didn't believe it would. But now when it's above 50 and in some countries 100, Russian companies will invest in renewable energy as well. So I don't think we should really be too scared about this. Russian government is run by people who don't believe in green energy, mostly believe in fossil fuels, but there is a new generation that's coming up, and definitely the private sector will invest more and more. Now, the big reforms are unlikely to come before the regime change, but there will be adjustment at the company level and maybe even at the city level, because younger generation sees that Europe is changing, and as you rightly said, even China is changing. China is going to be net zero 2060, or at least that's what they say, and so there may be a dramatic change. So I'm much more optimistic today than it was before. So I, as a video blogger, I have to say I have a YouTube channel which you absolutely need to watch, and there are two videos there that I recorded with Tatiana Mitrova and Vladimir Drebentsov. It was done a year ago, last summer, and there is this view that Russian government is missing the boat. Now the conversation will be completely different. I actually talked to Vladimir Drebentsov yesterday about this issue, and to another person then I am not supposed to name, but also equally qualified. They both believe that there is much more discussion about that within Russian elite, and there'll be more action coming up.
Thank you, Sergei. I know that Florent Parmentier also has a question. Florent is the Secretary General of Sevipov think tank related to Sciences Po University. Florent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I wanted to maybe to come back to some starting point with the issue of information that you mentioned. And I think the latest events that we have seen with the COVID-19 in Russia is very interesting in this perspective. I think in one of the paper you wrote for, I think it was a paper for Terra Nova a few months ago, which I found very interesting and confirms some of what you think about of your thoughts about the fact that one of the key issue of or the key specificity of the Russian regime is not only I mean the fact that it relies on some aspects about the manipulation of information. What we have seen with let's say what we have seen with the start of the crisis in Russia was like the announcements were like everything is okay and we are like the country which is the best fitted for the crisis, in a sense that everybody had some issues, but I mean it was just lots of people within the hospital and not many with the COVID-19. It was everybody has another kind of sickness, etc. What we have seen now is the fact that everybody in Russia, or not everybody, but maybe 70% of the people is really reliant of taking a jab for the COVID. For the Sputnik V, which is seen as the best brand abroad, and now what they want is some other national kind of national kind of jabs, but not the Sputnik V. So if we consider the current situation, maybe my question would be to, let's say, do you think that the COVID-19 crisis is a series of difficulties that all the different players, international players, have seen, and all the countries have been performing in one aspect and not the other. And if you look at, for instance, China was not very performing in the first round because in the first place didn't know how to react, etc. So maybe if I can summarize everything and put it in a nutshell, how do you see as the current situation in Russia with a necessity to go for vaccination? The trust of people is very low. And the capacity of Russia, the main problem of Russia was not a problem of scientific potential, but rather of trust. How do you assess, I mean, the current situation, and how do you see the current Russian authority go through this situation? I mean, how do you see, I mean, the next steps before in terms of vaccination and in terms of I would say trust building for the current regime before the next elections
in September?
Yeah, thank you, Florent. Yes, I actually stand by what I wrote in that article in Terra Nova in January, and just you need to update the numbers. The numbers are even more horrifying than they were in January, because a lot of people died in January and February and are dying actually now. And in that sense, in that sense, this is a huge, huge issue for Russia, and all these issues that we discussed with Anastasia, how Russian government decided not to spend money to support households. These issues actually play out to mortality. Why? Because when people have no cash, they cannot stay home. And you can trace people not staying home using Google and Apple data. So these data are public. You can see that Russians during the highest waves of COVID would work and would go to shops because they didn't have cash, they didn't have savings. And so we shouldn't be surprised that so many people actually die. Another problem is that Russian government lied to Russians. They said we have won this war on COVID. They've not introduced the second lockdown in the fall when it was extremely, extremely dangerous and many people died because of that. And that's why the trust was destroyed. Another issue, as you mentioned, is distrust to the vaccine because tests were completely politicized. I believe that Sputnik is a great vaccine. Well, not great, probably comparable to AstraZeneca. It's a good vaccine and should be used. But I also see how tests were, let's put it this way, falsified and politicized. And then on top of that, Russia doesn't have enough capacity to produce. And again, every month, Russian government would say, we'll produce 100 million next month, or at least until the end of the year. And then next day they say no. And then they would say, we vaccinated 20 million people. Next day, they would say, we vaccinated 15 million people. And then Putin says, I got an injection, and then I will not tell you which vaccine I got. So all of that generates distrust. And that, of course, creates, indeed, as you said, 60% of Russians don't want to get vaccinated. And about half of this number doesn't believe in the vaccine. Half of this number actually says, I will wait and see what happens. And what will Russian government do? Russian government will force vaccination, introduce forced vaccination. And then the problem, of course, is since you don't have enough vaccines, forced vaccinations will first work in Moscow. So Moscow will be fully vaccinated. Regions will continue to be infected and dying. And then it will be more and more vaccination rolled out in the regions. And I think that is actually a very important research question. We will see which regions Russian national government cares for. So whether after Moscow, St. Petersburg will be forced to vaccinate and vaccines will be provided or not. So things like this are not known. We'll see that. Now, I'm really scared about forced vaccination for two reasons. One, when you're forcefully fed something, you start to distrust this. You say Russian government needs to force it on me. That means people don't buy it. I may not want it, but what matters is 60% of my fellow citizens don't like it. And they probably know something. So since they don't want to get vaccinated, this is really bad vaccine. And then on top of it is corruption. Anastasia mentioned corruption. So what's happening now in Russia, you have the fake vaccination certificate. So you come to a doctor and he gives you a true vaccination certificate, except you don't get the vaccine. So the doctor takes the vaccine out and throws it away and says, let's pretend you got vaccinated. And you say, thank you, doctor. I hate the vaccine, so that's why I'm paying you for this, throwing away the vaccine. And so you get a real certificate. But then what happens is when you actually die, other people say, look, he got vaccinated, he got a real vaccination certificate, and he died. So vaccine actually does not protect. And that further destroys trust in the vaccine, and actually you have this vicious circle. So I'm really scared about this. And I think situation is going to be very bad, and I'm really worried, and I'm scared that more people will die. So that's now, this is not just Russia's problem, right? Because even if you don't care about Russians, you should be worried about Russian variants. So if a virus is not suppressed, it circulates and it creates a new variant which is resistant to Sputnik, which means it's also resistant to AstraZeneca. So we should all be extremely scared about this. So I'm really, really worried. And another issue is election. So Russian government wants to run the election in September, which means there'll be even more infections and deaths because of the election. So I don't know. I'm really worried.
On this bright note, we are going to terminate the exchange. Thank you so much for everybody for coming.
Let me just add one thing. There is a question by Mary Avanisyan in the chat, which is asking.
Any question? Go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, there is a question whether democracy is not the best regime for some countries and economies. So my answer to that is maybe. As a scholar, I don't know, but I would really love people to say that in honest democratic vote, to say that we don't like democracy, we like corrupt autocracy, corrupt kleptocracy, we don't want prosperity. I want people to do that. If somebody in Europe tells you Russia or Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan doesn't deserve democracy because people are different, they like autocracy, I think it's a racist statement. I really think these are the real Russophobes who say that Russians are different from Swedes and don't deserve democracy. Swedes also had a monarchy just 100 years ago. Well, they still have a monarchy, but still Swedes didn't have a democracy 100 years ago, and 200 years ago, nobody had a democracy. 50 years ago, in no canton in Switzerland, women could vote. It's because why women should vote? Why do they deserve the vote? Thought the Swiss. And suddenly now we think it's normal that women also vote, even in Switzerland. So I think it's really a racist statement saying that some people are second-class nations, ethnicities, societies relative to Europe. Europeans know how to handle democracy, and these people don't. Now, in Europe, democracy also didn't come easily. And Germany, as you may remember, democratically elected one of the most horrible regimes in history. But that doesn't mean that Germany doesn't deserve democracy. I think Germany does.
This is a much higher note to end on. Thank you, Sergei. And we remember this. If we have to walk out with one kind of message, is that every country deserves democracy, and if people don't want it, they just have to vote it out.
Exactly, and after Swiss state gave voting rights to Switzerland, to women, sorry, Swiss national football team beat French national team. That didn't happen 50 years ago. That didn't happen 50 years ago. These players were born by voting women.
This is an excellent remark. I suggest to everybody to turn on their microphone and let's give Sergei a round of applause. Thank you so much, Sergei. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very nice. Thank you.
Everybody have a great evening and see everybody back in September for our new series on energy diplomacy. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much, Anastasia, for organizing this. Thanks for excellent questions.